All the pretty horses. Moon of the first snowfall, November 29th, 1864, Sand Creek, Indian Territory. Kill them all, big and small. Nits make lice. I long to be wading in gore. Colonel John M. Shivington. The warriors sat their horses on the rim of the canyon above the icy waters of the creek below. Faintly backlit by the breaking dawn, they were watching helplessly, just out of firing range of the long guns. Observant, waiting, their hearts willing the escape of those that had also managed to evade the surprise attack. Having failed to fend off the bluecoats, they had now stationed themselves here as a last defense against the soldiers skirmishing below. Black Kettle's wife, Mo Hovato, lay sprawled on the muddy near bank, her riderless mount now scrabbing up the icy slope, fear propelling it beyond the screams and shouts of the surrounded encampment below. As the sun continued to rise, the bloodied water of the creek moved coldly on. Those too young, too old, or too wounded to escape or fight were being rounded up and placed under guard. Silver Spotted Owl, his white braids now crimson with blood, lay slumped against a broken lance, feebly trying to replace his glistening entrails, seemingly oblivious to the surrounding carnage. From the agonized movements of his mouth it could be seen he was chanting his death song. It could not carry above the tearing sounds of the repeating rifles and the cannon booms. An old man's half-clothed body was being dragged around the perimeters of the camp by a mounted cavalryman who was waving his glistening saber in triumph. When Colonel John M. Shivington was told that those routed by the surprise attack consisted mainly of women and children, he replied, "Kill and scalp all, big and small. Nits make lice." An inventory of the spoils began once the enemy was subdued. A lieutenant approached him to inquire of the deposition of the white flag that now hung listlessly from the chief's lodge next to the prominently displayed stars and stripes. There was a gory pile of winter robes, some that had been ruthlessly pulled from beneath sprawled bodies, caches of powder and lead, and all of the village's meager winter food supplies that had been quickly assembled. A bluecoat was wetting a writing stick between his lips and taking note of the varied plunder, from dried meat to raw hide lariats. For what the army had no use of would be destroyed to further deprive these Indians of the least means of survival. First the officers, then some of the hated Pawnee scouts were walking among the pony herd, selecting the finest mounts as their own. White Antelope dropped his bow and staggered out into the icy waters of the creek, hands held high above his head. His death song sprang from his lips. Nothing lives long, only the earth and the mountains. A dazed look was the only indication that his attempt at surrender was met with a fusillade of bullets. At a little cutback in the creek where some women were trying to hide with their children, the sharpshooters were gamely picking them off one by one from their excellent vantage point. A child, just barely able to walk, pulled itself screaming in panic from the arms of its mother and was felled by a carefully placed shot to her midsection. A 700-man force of the Colorado Territory militia had descended on this peaceful encampment of Cheyenne and Arapahoes who had left the confines of Fort Lyon when the new soldier chief had told them to go and hunt buffalo to feed yourselves. There was no game on the reservation. Black Kettle had sent most of his warriors east toward Smoky Hill under the army until the army gave permission for new rations. Besides, he had been told as long as he flew the American flag, he and his people would be safe from U.S. soldiers. Now their peaceful camp was awakened by howitzers and cavalry charges. Each warrior on the cliff above it narrowed his eyesight to try and discern just who would be led away. Every few minutes a soldier raised a looking-glass to his eye and glanced nervously up at their assembly, then hurried to report. Orders were being given. Supply wagons had now arrived, and those Indians not grievously wounded were being herded toward a hastily erected tent. Some bodies were dragged from the lodges before they were put to flame. Contents thought valuable were hastily carried out. Parfleshes with their tasty pemmican were kept, but medicine bundles, shield, lavishly beaded scalp shirts, and all weapons were to be consigned to the flames. Here and there one of the Colorado volunteers snatched a colorful trophy to claim as a battle prize. Many were unconcernedly desecrating the dead, bowie knives flashing in the growing light of day. Others ran, seeking those still alive, to stop their breath forevermore, even those too feeble or too young to possibly escape. Snowfall was thin, but pitiless in how it barely obscured vision. Carbines, pistols, and lances were still being brandished, although there was no further bloodshed. The 4 big guns the army mules had hauled here stood ominously silenced. Soldiers were being assembled to receive more ammunition from one of the well-laden supply wagons. Lodge poles were lassoed and lodges pulled abruptly down into their burning remains. The warriors braced themselves with fear for the remaining women, children, and old ones, clustered in despair and shock below. Would they all be slaughtered? Some men had managed to cross the shallow creek to quickly dig rifle pits and provide coverage for those still running to escape. Cooking fires smoldered, and a few dogs slunk around, lapping at the spilled contents from the overturned pots. One mangy yellow cur tentatively sniffed at a lifeless form sprawled in the bloody snow. Unrelenting wails and cries rose up from a few that had been spared. Yellow Wolf had gone beyond, One Eye, War Bonnet. As one, an armed detail of the militia advanced, not toward the captives, but toward the several hundred ponies backed up into the canyon. A sharp command rang clearly out, and the guns began barking again. The small war pony of white dogs spun screaming in the midst of the herd, blood gouting from its neck. The rapid discharge of guns was deafening. The animals milled in aimless terror. Those attempting to escape the slaughter were held back by the steep surrounding walls. As the bodies dropped, writhing and kicking, screaming in confusion, the execution squad advanced. 900 ponies were a lot to dispatch, and there was no efficiency to this job. A captain stopping to reload had his arm swiftly broken by a crashing body. 2 men had to be summoned to drag him from under the horse's carcass. Another soldier, running closer to get a better shot, tripped over a picket pin, breaking his leg. Cordite and the coppery smell of blood rose once more from the valley's floor. A young recruit who had no stomach for the slaughter withdrew under the guise of reloading to retch into the snowbanks. Others shot carefully, with a fixed grimace, as though at some competition. Eventually an order came through to begin cutting the animals' throats to save ammunition. Colonel John M. Shivington's voiced desire was coming true this day when he had expressed to the new commander of Fort Lyon, "I long to be wading in gore." Warriors were now screaming in outrage from the cliffs, helpless to interfere. When the neighing and pitiful nickering were finally barely perceptible, a shocked silence settled in. Only a twitch of a haunch here and there rose from hundreds of animals whose blood was rapidly freezing on the newly falling snow. Ghostly wisps of steam that rose from the slight warmth of the carcasses seemed to fill the valley. The chaos that had gripped the encampment had been disciplined into an efficient rout. The army was now finished here, and the order given to fire the village. One lodge after the other flared up in greedy pyres of all contents, sacred and profane. The elegant feathers of a war bonnet fluttered weakly before bursting into flame. Bare branches of the cottonwoods rose starkly against the heavens. Not a bird cry rang out. Up on the rim, Cottonwood Boy watched the wealth and resources of a small nation destroyed, his blood cold, his young heart irreparably hardening. Obscured by the smoke from the black kettle's burning lodge, the white cloth flown to signify peace hung limp in surrender next to the striped flag that had been given to the leader as a guarantee of protection for his camp and his people. The few survivors of this winter village were now successfully deprived of food, lodging, and transportation, all that was precious to them destroyed, except what they carried on their backs and in their hands. Something new had been given to them, a new burden to wear, or to cast off if they could. Not just loss, grief, poverty, hunger, and starvation, but bitterness, defeat, and the burning coal of desire, a passion that is at times irresistible, a passion for revenge. This encampment on Sand Creek had trusted in the protection afforded them, and they were betrayed brutally. There had been no hostiles in this camp, no dog soldiers, very few warriors. The irony was that their men had been sent out to hunt, to provide food for the weaker members of the band. The Cottonwood boy had managed to bring a few ponies from the herd when he scrambled across Sand Creek and up the ravine to relative safety above. These ponies were now being given to the women and children that had managed to escape, and such old ones who had been helped. The bravest of the warriors fought to hold off the soldiers, allowing a few to escape. As the soldiers began a retreat, the north wind brought a screen of thick flakes to obscure the devastation below. But what ravaged the spirits of these survivors would never be blotted from their memory. Now they must attempt to survive those losses. The question that had troubled the Cottonwood's heart all these moons since his quest, "Who am I?" was answered that day as he looked down on the bloody trail left behind them in the snow. "I am a warrior." All desire to bring healing to his people left his mind. Blazing now was the vision of himself grasping a blue-shirted soldier by the hair, his scalping knife already vibrating with an unquenchable thirst. Hands which he once thought would bring healing to his people now hung limp at his side as he fought back images from his mind. With each intake of the frigid air into his lungs, and with each wail and cry of loss it carried on the air as they struggled north, he knew not what he would become, but whatever it was, he willed it to harden, to become strong, strength, endurance. That night, under the cover of darkness, a band of determined warriors, the boy included, left hoping to secure some of the remnant of the herd. They returned in silent triumph, driving a few hundred of those ponies that had been taken during the attack. Now that they had the means to move out onto the snow-clogged and wind-swept plains, they would seek refuge from other bands further north. Most of them survived the bitterness of 3 days' travel, arriving at the hunting camp of Oglala warrior Tusunke Witko, Crazy Horse, where food and shelter was summarily provided. When their story was told at a hastily called council, a decision was made to make their way and join forces with a larger village, that of another leader known for despising the Wasichus, Tatanka Ayotake, Sitting Bull. The survivors were most generously welcomed. Not only food and lodging were shared, but robes and good pipes were bestowed as gifts, the blessings from those with good hearts. Up here, the northern Cheyenne wrapped their braids with strips of red-painted buckskin and wore feathers of the crow in their hair, but their hearts were as theirs. Both Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse disdained the white man's road and viewed coming to a reservation as something that would deprive their people of their spirits. How could they surrender the very hunting grounds that had been given to them by the spirits of the game they captured? While Crazy Horse did not lead with his oratory, Sitting Bull was able to rouse all that heard him. Both leaders understood that a massive confrontation could not be avoided. Sitting Bull spoke. "These soldiers have come shooting. They want war. We must stand together or they will kill us separately."